The day Annie Easton showed up at the Brenner Ranch with a still-warm peach pie balanced in both hands and the August sun beating down on the back of her neck, she had no idea she was about to walk into the most quietly broken life she had ever encountered. The town of Crestfall, Texas sat in the shadow of the Llano Estacado like a man waiting for bad news, baking in the summer of 1883 with dust on every surface and a kind of stubborn pride that held its citizens together the way dried mud held a cracked riverbank. It was not a large town, but it was a real one, with a general store, a blacksmith, a church whose bell had not worked since a windstorm tore something loose 3 years back, and enough gossip to fill a newspaper twice over. The people who lived there knew each other the way people know each other when there is nowhere else to go and no one else to be known by. Annie had come to Crestfall 6 weeks before from Abilene, following her older brother Thomas, who had taken a job as deputy under Sheriff Cal Pickett. She was 24 years old, sharp-eyed and practical in the way that women had to be practical when they had buried a mother young and raised themselves to adulthood without a soft place to land. She had a quiet kind of beauty that did not announce itself, brown hair that the wind was always rearranging, and hands that were good at things, at baking, at mending, at the precise and careful work of making a place feel like home even when it was not. She had settled into Crestfall quickly enough, renting a room from Martha Cooley, who ran the boarding house and talked without ceasing from breakfast to supper and sometimes after. Within 2 weeks, Annie had helped 3 of the town's women put up preserves and had been introduced, formally and informally, to nearly every soul in Crestfall, all except one, Noah Brenner. She heard his name first from Martha, who said it the way people say the name of a place where something bad happened, with a lowering of the voice and a slight tightening of the face, as if the name itself still carried some residue of sorrow. "Brenner," Martha said, setting a pot of beans on the stove. "Noah Brenner has the ranch out past Cutter's Creek, the one with the big cottonwood at the gate. He does not come to town much. He used to back before." She stopped there, and when Annie asked back before what, Martha made a small sound and pressed her lips together. "Before he shut himself away," Martha said finally. 6 years now. He sends that boy, young Clem, into town for supplies every few weeks, pays good money, never shorts anyone, but he does not come himself and he does not invite company." "Why?" Annie asked. Martha looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has asked a question that everyone has already decided is too large to answer over beans. "Some things happen to a person," she said carefully, "and the world gets rearranged after. You just have to give a man his quiet." That should have been the end of it. It was none of Annie's business what Noah Brenner did with his own piece of land and his own life, and she had plenty to occupy her own days without puzzling over a man she had never met. She helped Martha with the boarding house on some mornings, spent afternoons helping Mrs. Garza, who was elderly and getting slower on her feet, and made herself useful at the general store when old Pete Darrow needed someone to manage the accounts, which he was becoming too nearsighted to do reliably. But Crestfall was small, and stories had a way of filling the empty spaces between people. She heard more over the following weeks. From Pete Darrow, who had known the Brenner family since Noah's father had first staked out that land 20 years back. From Mrs. Garza, who had a particular warmth in her voice when she mentioned the Brenners, as if they had once been something good in her life. And from her brother Thomas, who had ridden out twice to the Brenner property on routine matters and had been met at the gate both times, never at the door. Noah Brenner was 31 years old. He had been well regarded once, a rancher of real skill, a man who came to church on Sundays and helped neighbors through hard seasons without making a fuss about it. He had been married. His wife's name had been Clara, and she had died in the winter of 1877 along with the child she was carrying, a fever that had moved fast and left nothing behind but Noah Brenner standing in the cold with the world entirely remade beneath his feet. He had not let anyone past his front gate since. The ranch still ran because he was capable and stubborn, and because the land itself seemed to respond to him. He had good cattle, good horses, enough to keep going. Clem Hadley, barely 16 and half-orphaned himself, came and went as his helper, but even Clem had told Thomas that he had never once been inside the main house. He did his work in the barn, took his meals from a basket that was left outside for him on a hook by the back door, and understood without being told that there were lines a person did not cross. Annie thought about all of this with the kind of quiet attention she gave to things that mattered. She was not a fixer by arrogance. She did not think herself able to solve things that 6 years of weathering had made into stone. But she was honest, and she had a particular discomfort with the idea of a person being left entirely alone with their grief until it became their whole identity, until they had forgotten what it felt like to have another human being in the same room with them and be easy about it. It was Mrs. Garza who gave her the occasion. "He used to love a peach pie," Mrs. Garza said one afternoon, sitting in her garden while Annie helped her repot some struggling herbs. Clara would make it every August when the peaches came in from the Henderson orchard. He always said it was the best thing a summer could produce. She paused. "The Hendersons have peaches right now. I was going to send some preserves out with Clem next week, but my hands have been giving me trouble." "I could take them," Annie said before she had entirely considered it. Mrs. Garza looked at her steadily. "He does not like company." "He does not have to like it," Annie said. "Preserves can be left at a gate." Mrs. Garza was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "If you were going to take the peaches anyway, you might as well do something proper with them." So that was how Annie found herself, on the second Thursday of August 1883, in Martha's kitchen at 6 in the morning, making a peach pie. She made it carefully, the way her mother had taught her, with a lattice crust and enough sugar to balance the tartness, and a pinch of cinnamon that was perhaps not traditional but was, she thought, an improvement. She wrapped it in a cloth when it came out of the oven and let it cool just enough that it would not fall apart in her hands, and then she borrowed the board to carry it on and set off. The walk to the Brenner Ranch was just over 2 miles from the edge of town. Annie was not a woman who minded walking. The morning was still cool enough to be bearable, and the light came in low and gold across the flat Texas land, turning the dry grass into something almost beautiful. She passed Cutter's Creek, which was low this time of year but still running, and she found the gate with the big cottonwood just as Martha had described it, a massive old tree with roots that had grown through and around and under the fence posts, as if reclaiming them gradually for the earth. She stood at the gate. The ranch house was visible from there, perhaps 100 yards back from the road, a solid and well-made structure of timber and stone that had the look of something built by someone who intended to stay. It was not fine, but it was not neglected either. The yard around it was swept. There were horses in the far pasture. The barn off to the left looked freshly repaired in one corner where new timber was paler than the old. Someone had planted morning glories along the fence that ran to the side of the house, and they were blooming, which seemed to Annie like a piece of information worth keeping. The gate was not locked. There was a latch, and she opened it. She had intended to knock and leave the pie on the step if no one answered, because she was a practical woman, and she was not going to pretend to herself that she had some particular mission here. She just did not like the idea of leaving something impersonal at a gate for a man who had already had so many impersonal things in his life. She walked up the path and knocked on the front door. There was a long silence, and then footsteps, and then the door opened, and she found herself looking at Noah Brenner for the first time. He was not what she had expected, and she had not known what she had expected until she realized what she had gotten wrong. She had composed a picture in her mind from the fragments of description she had gathered, and she had imagined a man diminished by grief, hollowed out, wearing his isolation like an ill-fitting coat. What she saw was something different. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair that was longer than fashionable and a jaw that carried several days of not having been attended to. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that caught the morning light in a way that was entirely unfair. He was, in a word, striking, and he was looking at her with an expression of such complete bewilderment that she felt a sudden, almost unmanageable desire to laugh. He had opened the door, she would realize later without thinking. He heard the knock, and his body had simply responded before his mind could intervene. The way habits formed in easier times will sometimes surface past the walls a person builds around themselves. He opened the door and there she was, and for one extraordinary moment neither of them said anything. Then Annie held up the pie. "I am Annie Easton," she said. "I am boarding with Martha Cooley and helping Mrs. Garza when she needs it. She wanted you to have this. The Hendersons had peaches and she said you were partial to a good peach pie. I told her I would bring it out." He looked at the pie. He looked at her. He looked at the pie again. "Mrs. Garza sent you," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected and a little rough, as if it had not been used quite enough. "She sent the sentiment," Annie said. "I made the pie." Something moved across his face, not quite an expression, more like the shadow of one passing through. He looked past her briefly at the gate standing open behind her and then back at her face, and she could see him doing some internal calculation that she could not entirely read. "You can leave it on the step," he said. "I know I can," she said pleasantly. "I was going to do exactly that, and then you opened the door." He stood there holding the door and staring at her, and she could see the precise moment when he recognized the logic of what she had said and could not find a counter to it. There was a faint, brief thing that happened at the corner of his mouth, a thing that was not quite a smile but was in the general neighborhood of one, and then he stepped back without entirely deciding to and said, "I suppose you had better come in, then." Annie Easton walked into Noah Brenner's house with her peach pie and the August morning light at her back, and she stepped across a threshold that had not been crossed by another living person in 6 years. The inside of the house was not what she might have expected, which seemed to be a theme with Noah Brenner. It was not in disarray. It was not draped in dust and accumulated sorrow the way she might have imagined for a man who had sealed himself away. It was clean in a spare, methodical way, as if someone had removed everything that was not necessary and maintained what remained with deliberate attention. There was a table with 2 chairs, a counter with a basin, a stove that was clearly well used, a stone fireplace that took up most of the far wall. There were shelves with books, which surprised her, more books than she would have predicted for a ranching household. There was also, on the windowsill above the basin, a single clay pot with a geranium in it, bright red and carefully tended, and that detail undid something small inside Annie's chest that she kept the undoing of entirely off her face. "Your place is very well kept," she said, setting the pie on the table. "I do not like disorder," he said. He was standing just inside the door, still holding the frame of it as if he might need to close it quickly, watching her with those gray-green eyes with an alertness that had nothing hostile in it but was entirely unguarded, which was somehow more intimate than hostility. "Neither do I," Annie said. "Shall I cut it, or would you rather have it later?" He was silent for a moment. "I have coffee on," he said, and it sounded like a question he had not meant to ask. "I would not refuse a cup," Annie said. He moved to the stove, which was a thing that seemed to happen outside of his own planning, and Annie sat down at the table without asking permission, because she had the sense that asking would give him time to reconsider. And whatever was happening right now in this kitchen was fragile in the way that new ice is fragile, something that could hold weight only if you moved across it steadily and without hesitation. He brought coffee in 2 plain tin cups and set one in front of her, and stood for a moment looking at his own kitchen, as if trying to remember how it was supposed to be used with another person in it. Then he sat down in the chair across from her, and that was the first time in 6 years that Noah Brenner sat across a table from another human being in his own home. He did not say anything for a moment, and Annie did not fill the silence artificially. She drank her coffee, which was strong and bitter and very good, and she looked out the window at the morning glories on the fence, and she waited. "How long have you been in Crestfall?" he asked finally. 6 weeks, she said. My brother is Thomas Easton. He is Deputy Pickett's new man, a flicker of recognition. I have heard the name, I have not met him. You do not come to town, Annie said, not as an accusation, just as a fact. No, he said. You send Clem Hadley, she said. He is a capable boy, Noah said, and there was genuine warmth in those 4 words, brief and unguarded, the warmth of a man who has been alone so long that his affection for others has gotten concentrated, stored in small vessels because there are so few of them. He is, Annie agreed. He helped Thomas move his trunk when he arrived, worked for 2 hours without being asked and then refused payment. Noah's expression shifted towards something that was unambiguously a small smile, the first one she had seen, and it changed his face in a way that she noted with careful casualness and filed away. That is Clem, he said. She cut the pie then because the coffee needed it, and because a pie left uncut is a waiting thing, and they had both been patient enough with waiting. He tasted it and was quiet for a moment, and she watched his face with the detached attention she had learned to bring to things she wanted to understand. And what she saw there was something that had no simple name, not sadness, exactly, but the expression of a man encountering something good that arrives alongside something painful, the way sweetness and ache are sometimes the same sensation pressed together until they cannot be separated. It is very good, he said at last. His voice had gone a little careful. Mrs. Garza told me you were fond of peach, she said. Clara, he stopped, picked up his coffee cup, put it down. My wife used to make it. I know, Annie said quietly. I am sorry about your wife, Mr. Brenner. I am sorry about what you lost. The silence after that was different from the silences before. It had weight and texture. He looked at the table for a long moment, and then he looked at her, and his expression had something in it that she had not seen before on a man's face, at least not directed at her, a kind of wondering, undefended openness, as if she had said the exact words that fitted the exact shape of something he had been carrying, and the fit of it had surprised him. People usually do not say it plainly, he said. I find that plainness is kinder, she said. He nodded once slowly, and they sat in the morning kitchen with the light coming in and the smell of peach and coffee around them, and it was not comfortable exactly. It was too charged for comfort, but it was something real, and that was better. She did not stay long after that. She was aware that she had already been granted something unusual, and she did not intend to push past what had been offered. She finished her coffee, thanked him for it, told him the rest of the pie was his to do with as he liked, and walked to the door. Thank you, he said from behind her, and the word came out with a solemnity that made her understand it was not just about the pie. Good morning, Mr. Brenner, she said, and let herself out. She walked back to Crestfall in the full morning sun with the empty cloth and the board under her arm, and she thought about gray-green eyes in a clay pot with a red geranium in it, and she was very careful not to think about it in any particular way that would require examination. The week that followed was an ordinary one, or mostly. Annie worked and walked and talked to people and made herself useful, as she was in the habit of doing. She told Mrs. Garza that the pie had been delivered and received, and the old woman's face did a complicated and satisfied thing that Annie chose not to investigate. She did not expect to see Noah Brenner again, or not soon. She was walking back from the Garza house on a Wednesday evening, 8 days after her visit to the ranch, when she heard hoofbeats on the main road and looked up to see a rider coming in from the direction of Cutter's Creek. It was a horse she did not know, a big roan, well-kept and well-ridden, and it took her a moment to recognize the rider because she had only seen him once, seated across a kitchen table in still morning light, and here he was in motion and different. Noah Brenner rode into Crestfall. He did it without ceremony, at an ordinary pace, in clean clothes that were not fancy but were good. He went to the general store first, which was where you went when you came to town for purposes, and Annie watched from a distance as he went inside. She did not follow. She kept walking, told herself this was nothing to do with her, and went back to the boarding house and helped Martha with supper and was entirely calm about it. She saw him again as she was crossing the street toward the boarding house, just as he was coming out of the general store with Pete Darrow beside him. And Pete was talking with the animated relief of a man who has been hoping for a conversation, and has finally gotten one. And Noah was listening with an expression of quiet attention that she recognized from their kitchen conversation. He glanced across the street at the same moment she was looking, and they saw each other, and he did a thing she would think about later. He stopped walking for just a half second, as if something had required a brief interruption of his forward motion, and then he touched the brim of his hat. Annie nodded back and kept walking, and she was very composed about the warmth that moved through her chest like a slow coal. He was gone from town before supper, but he had been there. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Each time he went to the general store and sometimes to the blacksmith, and each time he spoke more freely with Pete Darrow and with Jake Harmon the blacksmith, and each time before he left he found some occasion to be in the same part of the street as Annie Easton, which might have been coincidence or might not have been, and each time they exchanged a few words that were ordinary and brief and were not ordinary at all. "How is Mrs. Garza's garden coming along?" he asked once. "Better," Annie said. "The rosemary is taking. She is threatening to grow tomatoes next year." "She will," he said. "She has been threatening it since 1878. Annie laughed because she had not expected his dry humor, and his expression shifted in that way it had, the shadow of something warm moving across it. "Good afternoon, Miss Easton," he said, and went to his horse. The fifth time he came to town, he came on a Saturday, and there was a kind of informal gathering in the street outside the general store, because Pete Darrow's wife had organized a small swap of preserved goods among several of the town women. Annie was there, and Noah came out of the store and stood for a moment on the steps looking at the small crowd with an expression that mixed several things she could now read more reliably: wariness and longing and something tentative and hopeful at the edge of it. She walked over. "If you stay," she said quietly, "Mrs. Harmon will press a jar of blackberry preserves on you and count it as a moral victory." "I am not sure I am ready to be someone's moral victory," he said. "Pete Darrow will tell anyone who listens that you are back," she said. "He considers it a civic improvement." Something shifted behind his eyes. "And what do you consider it?" asked, and the question was light enough in tone to be deflected, but the way he asked it was not light at all. She looked at him directly. "I consider it an improvement," she said. He stayed for an hour. He did not say much to the assembled people, but he was present and civil, and he accepted Mrs. Harmon's blackberry preserves with visible grace. And when he rode out and 3 different people turned to Annie with knowing expressions, she addressed herself to the preserves table with great industry. September came in with a wind that smelled of change. The days still warm, but with the evening air sharpening toward autumn, and the quality of the light on the land going golden and serious. Annie had been in Crestfall for 3 months now, and it had begun to feel, in the cautious way that places do, like somewhere she could stay. It was her brother Thomas who said what had been building in the air between people for several weeks. They were sitting on the steps of the boarding house after supper, watching the sky turn colors, and Thomas said without preamble, "Brenner rides in every week now." "He does," Annie said. "He did not ride in for 6 years before," Thomas said. "He did not," Annie said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Annie," he said with the particular tone of an older brother who is trying to be careful and is not entirely succeeding, "he is a good man by every account I have heard. He is also a man who was very broken by something and has been very alone for a very long time." "I am aware of that," Annie said. "I am not telling you to stay away," Thomas said. "I am telling you to be thoughtful." "Thomas," Annie said pleasantly, "I am always thoughtful." "You are always practical," he said. "That is different." She thought about that in the quiet of her room later, lying on the narrow boarding house bed with the window open and the September air coming through, and she was honest with herself in the way she tried to be about things that mattered. She was not being practical about Noah Brenner. She was doing something else, something that had less tidy edges and did not have a plan attached to it. She liked him, not in a small or manageable way. She liked the way he listened, the way he thought before he spoke, the particular kind of dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly, the evidence of his care in things. The morning glories on the fence, the geranium on the windowsill, the way Clem Hadley spoke of him with devotion that was clearly earned. She liked that he was honest and that he had grief in him that he did not try to dress up as something else. She also knew she was not going to pursue anything. He would come to where he came to in his own time, or he would not, and she was not going to manage or manipulate a man who was finding his way back to the world at enormous personal cost. But she hoped. The occasion that changed things came at the end of September, on a day that began badly for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them. Annie had been helping Pete Darrow with the store accounts when a commotion outside drew them both to the door. Two men she did not know had ridden in from the East, strangers, hard-looking, with the particular ease of men who are comfortable in situations that make other people uncomfortable. They were not outlaws in any identifiable way, but they had a quality that raised the hairs on Annie's neck before she could have explained why. They went into the saloon, which was their right, and Thomas came out of the sheriff's office and watched them go in with that flat-eyed watchfulness she recognized as her brother doing his job. By noon there was an altercation inside the saloon that Sheriff Pickett and Thomas both had to involve themselves in, and by mid-afternoon the strangers were escorted to the edge of town, with the firm but civil recommendation that they continue their travels. But before that happened, one of the strangers, a lean man with a red kerchief around his neck, had taken exception to something in the way Annie had looked at him when he passed her on the street, and he had said something to her that was the kind of thing men sometimes said to women when they wanted to establish that they did not regard them as people deserving of basic courtesy. Annie had said something back that was precise and cold and entirely accurate about his character, which was the kind of response she was capable of when required, and the man had taken a step toward her that was not quite threatening, but was headed in that direction. Noah Brenner had been at the blacksmith's, and he came around the corner at that moment, and he took in the situation with a single look, and he placed himself between Annie and the stranger with the unhurried, deliberate ease of a man who does not move from a position once he has taken it. He did not say anything aggressive. He did not make a speech. He just stood there with an absolute quality of stillness that communicated something very clearly, and the stranger looked at him for a long moment and then spat in the dust and turned away. He did not speak to Annie for a moment after the man had gone. He just turned and looked at her with something that was not quite an expression, something more interior than that, and she looked back at him and neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady, which she was proud of. "Good," he said. They stood there for another moment that lasted a specific amount of time she could not have measured. Then Thomas came out of the saloon looking for Annie, and the moment completed itself, and normal time resumed. But that evening, after the strangers had been sent on their way, and the town had subsided back into its ordinary rhythms, there was a knock at the boarding-house door. Martha answered it and came back to the kitchen with an expression that she was doing very poor job of keeping neutral. "Annie," she said, "Mr. Brenner is at the door." Annie went to the door. Noah Brenner was standing on Martha Cooley's porch with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do, and he looked at her and said without preamble, "I wanted to be certain you were well." "You already asked me that," she said, surprised into warmth. "I asked you in the street," he said. "I thought it deserved a proper asking." Annie looked at him for a moment, at the hat in his hands and the careful way he was holding himself. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "Martha has coffee." "I should not," he said, and then he said, "But yes, if it is not an imposition." It was not an imposition. Martha produced coffee with a speed that suggested she had already had it ready, and she sat with them for a respectable few minutes and then discovered a pressing task elsewhere with such obvious intention that Annie would have laughed if Noah's expression had not been so quietly concentrated on his coffee cup. "Those men," Annie said. "Do they worry you? Strangers coming through?" "Not unusually," he said. "Crestfall is on a route. There are always travelers." He paused. "Most are not like those two." "No," she said. "Most are not." A silence. Then he said, "You handled yourself well." "I handle myself well generally," she said. "But I was glad you were there." She said it simply, and he received it simply, and something shifted in the room between them that was not dramatic or sudden but was entirely significant, a small permanent rearrangement of the air. "I have been glad," he said carefully, as if choosing words with the attention you give to something you cannot take back, "that you came to Crestfall." Annie set down her coffee cup. "I have been glad of that too," she said. They looked at each other in Martha Cooley's well-lit kitchen with the smell of coffee around them and the September night outside, and it was the most honest and uncomplicated thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. He left not long after, back to his ranch and his quiet life, but the quiet was different now, had different things living in it. October came, and with it the cooler air and the change of color in the brush, the mesquite going amber and the afternoons growing shorter. Noah Brenner's visits to town became a fixture, something that people stopped remarking on as unusual and started treating as ordinary, which was its own kind of arrival. He and Annie fell into a pattern that was not a courtship in any formal sense, but was one in every real sense. She would sometimes walk in the direction of the Brenner ranch in the early mornings, and if he was working near the fence line, they would talk across it for a while, both of them pretending this was accidental even though it was not. He would sometimes wait for her outside the general store on Saturdays when she came to help with the accounts, and they would walk the short length of the main street together and back, which took longer than it had any reason to take. He told her things, gradually. Not everything, not all at once, but in the way that a man tells things when he has decided to trust someone, and the trust is building its own weight and momentum. He told her about his father, who had been a cattle rancher of the old school, a man of few words and steady hands who had taught Noah everything he knew about land and animals, and the particular discipline of staying when things got hard. He told her about the ranch itself, about which pastures he was trying to improve, about a plan he had for a new water source that he had been thinking about for 2 years and had finally decided to attempt. He told her about Clara, once briefly and carefully, on an October afternoon when they were both sitting on the top rail of the fence watching a hawk turn slow circles above the creek. He told her that Clara had been funny and brave and had sung badly and known it and done it anyway, and that her absence had not gotten smaller over time, only more familiar, the way a scar is familiar. He said it without seeking comfort, and Annie did not offer comfort as if it were a solution. She just listened and was there, and said that it sounded like Clara had been worth loving, and he nodded once and said yes she had been, and they watched the hawk until it decided on something and dropped from sight. What she gave him, she understood, was not a replacement for anything. She was not trying to be Clara, and he was not, she thought, trying to put her in Clara's place. What was happening between them was its own thing, grown from this particular soil, in this particular season, between these two particular people who had both learned the cost of things, and had not let the learning make them small. November brought the first serious cold, and with it something that had been building arrived. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Annie had walked out to the Brenner ranch with a legitimate reason. Mrs. Garza had asked her to return a book she had lent Noah some months before, and it was no great trouble to carry it out. And Noah met her at the gate with his sleeves rolled down against the cold, and an expression that told her he had been expecting her, which he must have heard from Clem, who had heard it from someone in town. They walked to the house together, and he let her in without the hesitation of that first morning, with the ease of someone opening a door to a place where the person has already been. He made coffee and they sat at the table with the book between them, and the afternoon settled around them with the particular stillness that November afternoons have, the light going gray and soft outside the window. She had been there perhaps an hour when he said, with the directness she had come to know as one of his fundamental qualities, "Annie." Something in the way he said her name was different, not louder, not softer, but loaded with an attention she had not heard there before. "Yes," she said. He was looking at his coffee cup and then he looked up at her, and his eyes had that entirely unguarded quality she had seen only a few times, the quality that appeared when he had stopped managing himself and was just present. "I have been trying to think of the right way to say something," he said. "You do not need to find the right way," she said. "Just say it." A small pause. "I care about you," he said. "I care about you more than I expected to care about anything again, and I have been honest with myself about that for some time now." Another pause, shorter. "I am not certain what that asks of you, or what it should. I know that I am not. I know the last 6 years have made me." He stopped, and she could see him struggling with the articulation of something that resisted words. "Noah," she said, and she used his first name as she had not done before, and the use of it was itself a statement. "You are not too broken for this." He looked at her with something that she could only describe as a kind of naked hope, the hope of a man who had told himself for years that something was impossible and has just been told by someone credible that it might not be. "I am not a simple man to be with," he said. "I am not looking for simple," she said. "I am looking for real." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and that was the first time he touched her, and it was not a small thing, not for either of them. His hand was large and work-hardened and warm, and she turned her hand under his so that their palms met and their fingers found each other. And they sat like that in the quiet kitchen with the gray November light outside, and neither of them said anything for a long while because nothing needed to be said. He walked her back toward town in the early dusk, and at the point where the ranch road met the main road he stopped and she stopped, and he looked at her in the last of the light with an expression she would remember with full clarity for the rest of her life. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. He smiled, and it was a real smile, not the shadow of one or the edge of one, but a full and unguarded one. And it transformed his face in a way that made the November air feel warmer than it had any business being. "Good," he said, and it was the same word he had used on the day of the strangers, but it held an entirely different world inside it now. December was a courtship in the full and deliberate sense of the word, carried out with the kind of patience and attention that both of them brought to things they valued. Noah came to town twice a week and sometimes 3 times, and they took meals together at the boarding house with Thomas and Martha present, and they walked in the cold air of the December afternoons and talked about everything, which turned out to be a large amount of territory. They talked about books. She was surprised by the range of his reading, and he was surprised by the sharpness of her opinions, and about the land and what it asked of people, and about Clem Hadley's future, which was something Noah had begun to think about seriously, and about Thomas's work and the ordinary challenges of a growing cattle town, and about small things that did not matter and somehow mattered very much. He showed her the ranch properly in December, on a bright cold Sunday when the sky was the hard deep blue of winter, and she walked with him through the pastures and to the site of the new water project, and to the barn where his horses were wintered, 3 good animals that he spoke to by name and with evident affection. She stood in the barn doorway in her coat with the cold air around her and watched him check the feet of the eldest horse, a gray mare named Patience, and she thought, "This is where I want to be." Not as a general proposition about the ranch or the county or the state, but this, specifically, this barn, this man, these horses, this cold blue sky, this life. She did not say it yet. She turned it over in her own keeping for a while, examined it from several angles, and found it true from all of them. Christmas came to Crestfall with the modest celebration that a small Texas town could manage. A church gathering that the congregation made the most of despite the broken bell. A community dinner that Martha coolly organized with the energy of a military campaign. And gifts exchanged in the careful, practical way of people who understood the value of things. Noah came to the Christmas dinner, which was itself a thing that several people noted quietly among themselves, with the warmth of people watching something good happen in real time. He sat across from Annie at the long table in the community hall, and was more at ease among people than she had seen him, still quiet, still reserved, but present in a way that was voluntary and undefended. And when the evening wound down and people bundled themselves against the cold and headed for their homes, he helped stack the chairs and carry the dishes without being asked, because he was a man who noticed what needed doing. They walked out together into the cold December night, and the sky above them was enormous and bright with stars in the way that only the open Texas sky can manage. And he stopped walking, and she stopped walking, and they stood together looking up. "Merry Christmas, Noah," she said. He turned to look at her, and then he did something that was both entirely unexpected and entirely inevitable. He took her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her breath catch, and he kissed her, properly and carefully, in the cold and the starlight. And Annie Easton kissed him back without hesitation because she had been waiting for it. She realized, since the morning she had walked up to his door with a warm pie in her hands, and he had opened it without thinking. He rested his forehead against hers afterward, and she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, and he said, very quietly, "I did not know I could feel this again." "Now you know," she said. He laughed, low and soft, and it was a laugh she had not heard from him before, unguarded and free, and she thought that might be the best sound she had heard since coming to Texas. January of 1884 was cold and demanding in the way that Texas Januaries could be, with nights that dropped below freezing and a wind off the plains that meant business. The cattle needed more tending, the roads got difficult after the one substantial snowfall that the county saw that winter, and life contracted the way it does when the weather requires it. But courtship does not pause for weather, or not theirs. Thomas drove her out to the ranch in the wagon on Sunday mornings and collected her in the late afternoons, with a discretion that was genuine and an expression that was carefully neutral. And Annie helped Noah with the indoor work when the outdoor work was impossible. And they sat in the evenings by the fireplace with its large stone hearth and talked and read, and were together in the particular companionship of people who have found their settled gravity in each other. Clem Hadley, who had spent more time at the ranch than usual because of the weather, was delighted by the whole arrangement in a way he tried to conceal with a teenage boy's elaborate pretense of indifference. He called Annie Miss Easton, with a formality that was so exaggerated it came back around to affection, and he had twice managed to be somewhere else with suspicious timing when Noah and Annie were in the same room together, and once Annie had caught him grinning outside the barn window at something he had no business grinning at. "You should stop encouraging him," Noah told her one afternoon. "I am not encouraging him," Annie said. "I am simply not actively discouraging him, which is different." Noah gave her the look he had developed for her moments of semantic precision, which was somewhere between exasperation and delight, and she smiled at him. "Annie," he said. "Noah," she said. "I love you," he said, and he said it the way he said most things, direct and clear and with full understanding of what the words meant and cost, and she felt the simple, absolute truth of it move through her like warm light. She set down the mending she had been doing, because this required her full attention. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since sometime in October when you told me about the hawk over the creek, and I thought about it for 2 months before I let myself be certain." 2 months. He said, "I am thorough," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hand, and they were quiet together for a long moment with the fire going and the January wind outside unable to touch them. February brought several things. First, it brought a conversation between Noah and Thomas that Thomas reported to Annie in careful and slightly abashed terms. Noah had ridden into town specifically to talk to Thomas, because he was serious about things and he believed in doing them properly. And the conversation had included the word intentions, used in its formal 19th century sense. And Thomas had shaken his hand and said he could not imagine a better man for his sister, which had pleased Noah more than he had expected. Second, it brought a difficult week when one of the cattle died of a respiratory illness that threatened to spread to 3 others. And Noah spent 4 days mostly sleepless managing the situation, with the concentrated, skillful dedication of a man who truly knew his land and his animals. Annie came to the ranch on the 4th day to find him at the fence looking drawn and exhausted and still steady, and she brought food that he needed to eat and sat with him while he did and did not say anything consoling because he was not a man who wanted consolation, he wanted company. The cattle recovered, all 3 of them. Third and most important, February brought a particular evening when they were walking back from an errand near the edge of town, and Noah stopped at a low spot in the road and looked at the sunset over the flat Texas land and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be certain before I ask it that I am asking it for the right reasons." "All right," she said. He turned to face her with the gravity that sat naturally on him, but was tonight something more than usual, something that had been considered and carried for weeks or months, she thought. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to come to the ranch and help me make it what it should be, and I want to sit across from you at that table for the rest of my life, and I want every morning to have you in it." She looked at him in the orange light of the sunset with the flat Texas land all around them and the wind moving through the dry grass, and she said, "Yes." He took both her hands and she felt the particular reality of his hands, the warmth and size and calluses of them, which were the hands of a man who worked and cared and stayed, and she thought, "This is real. This is the realest thing. I wanted to be certain," he said, "that I was asking because I want to build something with you and not because I am afraid of being alone." And she said, "It is not fear," he said. "It is something entirely different, something I did not expect to have again." "Good," she said, which was his word, and he heard it as his word and laughed the good laugh. They were married in the Crestfall Church in March of 1884, on a day when the first green was coming back into the land, and the sky was that clear, washed blue that comes with early spring on the Texas plains. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Haskell, who had a considerable amount to say about providential timing and second chances, and the general goodness of things, which was not his usual level of concision, but was entirely appropriate to the occasion. Mrs. Garza was there, sitting in the front pew with an expression of deep and satisfied peace, as if things had proceeded exactly according to a plan she had set in motion on a hot August morning with a basket full of peaches and a quiet conversation about a man who used to love pie. She was not wrong. Thomas walked Annie down the short aisle, and his face was the face of a man who is very happy for his sister and who is also working hard to keep his composure, which he managed mostly. Martha Cooley did not manage at all, but she was very cheerful about it. Clem Hadley stood in the back with his hat in his hands, cleaned up to a degree that clearly required effort, and his face throughout the ceremony was the face of someone watching a story end the right way. Noah stood at the altar in his best coat and he watched Annie walk toward him, and she watched him watching her, and what she saw on his face was not complicated or layered. It was simple and clear and absolute. The face of a man who has come back from a very long distance and found, beyond all reasonable expectation, that there is something worth returning to. She reached him and they looked at each other for a moment before Reverend Haskell began, and he said very quietly so that only she could hear, "You walked through my gate. You opened the door," she said. "I did," he said, without thinking. "Maybe," she said, "you were thinking more clearly than you realized." He smiled, the full real smile that still made her breath catch, and then Reverend Haskell called their attention to the matter at hand, and they were married under the Texas spring sky with the wind gentle, and the people who cared about them surrounding them. And it was right. Life on the Brenner Ranch after the wedding was a revelation to Annie in the best possible sense. Not because it was easy, because it was not always easy, but because it was full. The ranch demanded labor and attention and intelligence, and she gave all three without reluctance. She learned from Noah with the genuine interest of someone for whom learning is not a chore but a pleasure, and he learned from her things he had not known he needed to know, about managing the domestic side of the operation with more efficiency, about accounting, about the small social negotiations that kept a household connected to its community. She planted a proper kitchen garden in the spring, which Noah helped her prepare the soil for in the early morning hours before the day's main work began, both of them in the cold April air with the steam coming off their breath and the smell of turned earth around them, working in the comfortable silence of people who do not need to fill every moment with noise. Clem Hadley became a fixture in their lives in a way that was entirely natural and very good. He was now 17 and growing into someone serious and capable, and Noah had begun talking with him about the possibility of a more formal arrangement, learning the trade in a real way, with real prospects attached. Annie was fully in favor of this and said so without reservation, and Clem's response was a combination of dignity and poorly concealed excitement that made both of them fond. The summer of 1884 was a working one, and a good one. The water project that Noah had been planning for 2 years was finally executed and succeeded, which meant better access to a reliable source for the east pasture and a significant improvement in the condition of the cattle that grazed there. Annie learned to ride with more confidence, which Noah taught her with a patience that did not condescend, and she came to love it, the particular freedom of being on horseback on the flat land with the sky enormous above and the horse moving beneath her. They had disagreements, as people do, and worked through them in the way that people work through things when they are committed to each other and to honesty. He was sometimes too inward, retreating into himself when things were difficult in a way she had to learn to recognize, and he had to learn to resist. She was sometimes too practical, addressing emotional things with efficiency when they needed to be sat with, and he had to tell her that a few times before she fully understood what he meant. They were good at telling each other things. That was their particular gift to each other, the mutual willingness to say the true thing even when it was harder than the approximate thing. In the autumn of 1884, Annie told Noah that she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, which was their place, the table where she had first sat with a pie between them and the morning light coming in, the table that had been the site of every significant conversation they had ever had. She watched his face when she said it because she wanted to see the whole thing, and what she saw was a succession of things that moved through him the way weather moves, fast and real and unmistakable. Surprise, and then a rush of something that was joy, and then briefly a shadow of the old grief, because he had been here before the beginning of this, and it had ended in the worst way a thing can end, and she knew that was in him and she loved him enough to let it be there. She took his hand across the table. "I know," she said simply. He held her hand and was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I am afraid." "I know that too," she said. "It is reasonable to be afraid. And I am strong, and the doctor in Abilene is good, and I intend to be very careful and very stubborn about this, and you will not be alone in it." He looked at her with eyes that were bright and serious and full. "No," he said, "I will not." "Neither will I," she said. He came around the table and she stood up, and he held her for a long time in the autumn kitchen, not saying anything, just present, just there. And she held him back with the full strength of her arms and felt his heartbeat and thought about the life they were building and were going to build, and was not afraid. The winter was careful and the pregnancy was healthy, and Annie was indeed strong and stubborn about it, as promised. She kept working at a pace that was sensible if reduced. She ate well. She rested when she needed to, and she let Noah's watchful, sometimes hovering concern surround her without pushing it away, because she understood what it was and where it came from, and she loved him for it. The doctor from Crestfall checked on her regularly. Dr. Ambrose, a pragmatic man of 60 who had delivered half the children in the county, and who told Annie in November that she was entirely healthy and that everything was proceeding normally, and who told Noah, in the blunt man-to-man way he had, that worrying was fine up to a point, and beyond that point it became a disservice to everyone including himself. Noah received this counsel with the expression of a man who knows he is being told something true and finds it inconvenient. Mrs. Garza came to the ranch twice that winter, which required an effort on her part that Annie deeply appreciated, and sat in the kitchen with Annie in the afternoons, and told her things about childbirth and motherhood that were practical and unsentimental and very useful, and also told her stories about Noah as a boy that were a pure and unexpected treasure. Because there was apparently a version of Noah Brenner at age 8 who had climbed every tree on this property, and had a strong opinion about which horse was smartest, and had once tried to explain the arrangement of the stars to his father with a level of detail that had taken the better part of a Sunday. He was always serious, Mrs. Garza said, but he was not always sad. I am glad to see the serious one back without the sadness attached. I am working on the sadness, Annie said. You have done more than work on it, Mrs. Garza said. You have replaced it with something better. In the first days of April 1885, as the spring was properly arriving and the morning glories that Annie had replanted along the fence were beginning to show their first leaves, a boy was born to Annie and Noah Brenner. They named him Samuel, which was the name of Noah's father, and he came into the world making a considerable amount of noise about it, which the doctor said was an excellent sign, and which Noah, standing in that bedroom with his newborn son in his arms for the first time, seemed to find entirely miraculous. Annie, who was exhausted and certain and radiant in the way of women who have done something enormous and know it, watched Noah hold their son and felt something settle inside her that was complete in the way that very few things are complete. Not the end of something, not a conclusion, but a fullness that had room for everything that was still to come. "Hello, Samuel," Noah said to his son very quietly, and his voice was entirely undefended, all the walls down, and it was the voice of a man who has been given back something he thought was beyond recovery. "Hello." Samuel Brenner was a healthy and demanding and wonderful child, and the ranch in the spring and summer of 1885 was a different place than it had been in the 6 years before Annie walked through the gate. It was louder and less orderly and more alive. Clem Hadley, who had moved toward a more formal apprenticeship with Noah that would over the next few years become a genuine partnership, was extravagantly devoted to the baby in the way of young men who pretend not to care about such things, and could frequently be found making faces at Samuel in the barn while theoretically doing something useful. Thomas came to the ranch regularly and was a dedicated uncle in the same way he was a dedicated brother, with a practical warmth that expressed itself mostly in showing up and being useful and occasionally in saying the right thing at the right moment. His own life in Crestfall was going well. He had earned the genuine respect of Sheriff Pickett and of the community, and there was talk of him becoming the full deputy rather than a supplementary one, which Annie thought was deserved and told him so. Pete Darrow made a special trip to the ranch in May to congratulate them, and sat in the kitchen with Annie for 2 hours talking about everything. And on his way out he paused at the door and looked at the house and the yard and the spring morning around it with an expression of deep contentment and said to Noah, "It looks right. The place looks right now." Noah stood in his own doorway and looked at his ranch and the morning glories on the fence and the woman inside his kitchen through the window and said, "Yes, it does." The summer of 1885 passed in the full and working way of good summers, and autumn came again with its particular golden light, and life on the Brenner Ranch settled into the rhythms of a place that has found its true purpose and is doing what it is meant to do. There were difficult things because life always contains them. There was a dry spell in August that required hard management of the water supply and some real worry about the cattle. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher, a man named Tolliver who shared a fence line with Noah on the northwest side, and who had ideas about where that fence line should run that were not supported by the original survey. That required the intervention of Sheriff Pickett and several tense conversations before it was resolved, properly, in Noah's favor. There was a week in October when Samuel had a fever that brought the old fear roaring back into Noah's face, and Annie stayed up through 3 nights with the boy and the doctor came out from Crestfall, and Samuel's fever broke on the 4th day, and Noah spent an uncharacteristically quiet morning sitting on the porch with his coffee and the morning around him, recalibrating, as she knew he needed to do. She sat beside him on the porch that morning with her own coffee and her hand on his arm, and neither of them spoke, and the morning was cool and clear, and the horses were moving in the far pasture, and Samuel could be heard through the window making the entirely healthy sounds of an 8-month-old baby who has decided that lying quietly is not particularly interesting. "He is fine," Annie said. "I know," Noah said. "We are fine," she said. He turned to look at her, and his face had the thing in it she had first seen on the morning she brought the pie, the open and wondering thing that was his particular way of being glad, and he put his hand over hers on his arm and said, "I know that too. Better than I have ever known anything." Crestfall, Texas continued to be what it was, a real place, with real people and real struggles, growing slowly in the way that West Texas towns grew in the 1880s, with each small improvement requiring enormous effort and each hard season testing the patience and resilience of everyone who had chosen to stay. It was not always easy, and it was not always kind. The land itself was not easy or kind, the plains demanding a particular kind of toughness from the people who loved them. But there were good things. There was the general store where Pete Darrow knew everyone's name and extended credit when times were hard without making the debtor feel small about it. There was Thomas Easton, who became the full deputy, and then the sheriff when Cal Pickett retired in 1886, who ran his office with the same steady fairness he brought to everything he did. There was Mrs. Garza's garden, expanding every year, the threatened tomatoes having materialized in 1884 and continued to materialize every summer since, and the woman herself becoming over the years a kind of grandmother to both Annie and Noah, the person whose judgment they most trusted and whose company they most valued. There was also, growing quietly between Annie and Noah, something that had not been there in the first year and was not fully there in the second but was fully formed by the third. An ease. The particular ease of two people who know each other well enough to be entirely real in each other's presence, who have seen each other in difficulty and in joy and in the ordinary middle states that make up most of a life, and who have remained, through all of it, glad. He still had the geranium on the windowsill. She had added 3 more, and a plant she had read about in a seed catalog that turned out to be happiest in the kitchen window, and produced small orange flowers for most of the year. Samuel Brenner grew in the way of healthy, energetic boys who have a great deal of land to cover and not enough hours of daylight to cover it in. By the time he was 2, he was following Noah and Clem through the barn with the solemn determination of someone who has important work to do, and by the time he was 3, he had a very strong opinion about which horse was the best horse, and was willing to explain it at some length to anyone who would listen, which Noah said was a quality he was somewhat familiar with. In the spring of 1887, Annie told Noah at the kitchen table that there was going to be a second child. This time his face moved more quickly through the stages, the surprise was shorter and the joy got more room, and he said simply, "Good." And the word held everything it always held when he said it, which was the whole world. The second child was a girl, born in the October of 1887, and they named her Clara. Annie had thought about it first, turned it over with the thoroughness she brought to important things, considered whether it was right and whether Noah would want it or find it difficult. She raised it one evening by the fire carefully, and Noah was quiet for a moment and then said, "I would like that very much, if you would." "I would like it," Annie said. She should have her name in the world. Clara Brenner arrived with the autumn, smaller and more serene than her brother had been, with eyes that would settle eventually to a blue-gray that was her own particular color, and she was held by her father on the first morning of her life with a tenderness so complete that Annie watched it with full eyes and did not try to blink it away. Samuel, aged 2.5, was introduced to his sister with the gravity of a young person who has received important news and is deciding what to do with it. And after a long inspection he declared her very small and then, apparently satisfied, went to find Clem and report this assessment. The years that followed were the accumulation of a life lived well, in the particular way that lives lived well accumulate, not without difficulty, not without loss, but with a continuous and growing core of real things. The ranch became more prosperous as Noah's improvements to the water and the pasture management bore long-term results, and Clem Hadley's formal partnership gave the operation a reach it had not had before. And by the end of the 1880s, the Brenner Ranch was regarded in the county as one of the more successfully run operations, which Noah received without vanity, and which Annie thought was entirely earned. Thomas Easton, as sheriff of Crestfall, was a good one, thorough and fair, which was not always the same as easy, because the Texas of the 1880s had its share of the hard things that the frontier brought. Disputes over land and water, men passing through who meant no good, the slow and never entirely resolved tension over the rights and treatment of the Comanche and other tribes whose land this had been, and whose diminishment at the hands of policy and force and time was one of the ongoing injustices of the era. Thomas could not change what was larger than him, but he could manage what was within his reach with the decency that the people under his care deserved, and he did. Annie and Noah talked about these things, about the world they lived in and what it asked of them, with the seriousness both of them gave to things that mattered. She had seen enough of the treatment of people who had less power than others to feel the wrongness of it, and he had thought about it from the vantage point of a man who had been a neighbor to people of different kinds, and who had a fundamental distaste for the taking of what was not yours to take. They could not change the large shape of history, but they did what was in front of them. They dealt fairly with everyone. They paid their workers what was right. They did not participate in the casual cruelties that were so often simply accepted as part of how things were. In the summer of 1889, a dry and difficult season for the whole county, Noah organized a cooperative arrangement among several of the smaller ranchers in the area for sharing water resources during the worst weeks of the drought. It was the kind of practical generosity that did not announce itself, and that he would have been embarrassed to have made much of. But the men who benefited from it remembered, and the regard in which he was held in the community grew in the way that real regard grows, from the actual texture of a man's actions over time. By the time Samuel was 5 and Clara was nearly 2, the Brenner Ranch had the feeling of a place that had been entirely inhabited at last, not just maintained but lived in, with all the marks that living makes. The kitchen table had a scratch on one corner from a dropped pan. The porch had an additional chair that had been built to accommodate 3 people sitting out in the evening, because 2 had not been enough once Thomas started coming regularly for supper on Thursdays. The barn had a carving in the doorpost that said, SB 1888 in small careful letters, which Samuel claimed to know nothing about, and which Noah said he was going to address, and which had not been addressed and was not going to be addressed. Annie loved the scratch on the table and the extra porch chair, and the carving in the barn doorpost with a specificity and completeness that she had come to understand was the whole definition of home. Not the abstract idea of a place, but the accumulated particular marks of the people who live in it. The evidence that time has passed here, and people have been here, and things have happened, and the place has held all of it. She was sitting on the porch one October evening in 1889, with Clara asleep on her lap and Samuel somewhere in the vicinity of the barn being supervised by Clem, and the last of the sunlight going down in that flat, dramatic way it had over the Texas land, painting everything orange and gold. And Noah came out of the house and sat beside her in the extra chair, and they watched the sun go down together without saying anything for a while, which was one of their most comfortable ways of being together. Then he said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "6 years," he said. "Before you came, I did not let anyone in for 6 years." "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about what those 6 years were," he said, not just as loss, but as he paused, finding the words with his usual care, as a thing I had to live through to arrive at this. I cannot be sorry for it entirely, because the path that brought you here also required that. She looked at him in the last of the orange light, this man who had opened a door without thinking and changed the course of both their lives, and she thought about the pie in her hands that August morning and the gate standing open behind her and the first moment she had seen his face. "I am not sorry either," she said, "for any of it, not even the parts that were hard." He reached over and took her hand, which was something he did so naturally by now, the way you reach for things that are always there, the things you have made permanent in your life. "Neither am I," he said. Clara stirred on Annie's lap and made a small sound of displeasure at being disturbed in her sleep, and then settled again, and Samuel's voice could be heard from the direction of the barn making some argument with Clem that Clem was apparently losing. "He is going to be a great deal of trouble," Noah said. "He is exactly like you," Annie said. Noah looked at her with the expression she loved most on him, the one that was exasperation and amusement and love all running together without any seam between them. "That is an unkind thing to say to a man," he said. "It is a true thing," she said, "which I thought you valued." He laughed, the free and unguarded laugh that was still one of her favorite sounds in the world, and put his arm around her. And they sat on the porch of the Brenner ranch with the stars beginning to come out above them and their children nearby, and the land stretching away in every direction in the Texas dark. And it was good. The seasons continued, and the years built themselves one upon the next, and the life that Annie and Noah Brenner made was one of those lives that does not look grand from the outside. It was not famous or remarkable in any way that history would preserve, but that was full and true and built on real things. It was built on a conversation across a kitchen table with a still warm pie between them. It was built on the decision of a man to open a door, and the decision of a woman to walk through a gate, and the slow and remarkable work of two people choosing each other not just once, but every day after. In the spring of 1891, their third child arrived, a boy they named James, who came into the world with a head of dark hair exactly like his father's and a lung capacity that announced itself immediately, and continued to be a feature of his personality in the years to come. Samuel, who was 6 and therefore an expert on everything, was very pleased to have a brother. Clara, who was 3 and had developed strong aesthetic opinions about the world, inspected the baby and declared him acceptable. Noah held James with the same completeness with which he had held his first 2 children, and Annie watched his face and saw in it the thing she had been watching grow and deepen and settle over 8 years of marriage, which was the face of a man who is thoroughly, completely, bone-deep at home in his life. She had done that in part. He had done it in the larger part because no one can bring a person home who does not want to go. But she had opened a door in him, the same way he had opened his door to her, and whatever was alive and well behind it had proved to be more than either of them had known to hope for. Mrs. Garza came to see James in his first week, moving more slowly now but entirely herself, and she sat in the kitchen with Annie and held the baby with the authority of someone who has been holding babies for 70 years and knows exactly how it is done. And she looked around the kitchen, at the geraniums on the windowsill, and the scratch on the table, and the 3 children's shoes lined up by the door in order of size, and she said, "I told you August was a good month to bring a pie." Annie laughed until her stitches hurt. "I did not know you planned it," she said when she had recovered. "I did not plan it precisely," Mrs. Garza said serenely. "I just knew that man needed feeding and that you were the kind of person who fed people properly." "That is not exactly a romantic strategy," Annie said. "No," Mrs. Garza agreed, "but it is a true one." Noah came in from the yard at that moment and found his wife laughing and Mrs. Garza looking satisfied and his newest son asleep in old arms. And he stood in the doorway of his kitchen that was not a lonely room anymore, that had not been lonely for 8 years. And he looked at the life that was in it and thought about a morning in August when a woman had come to his door with a pie. And he had opened it without thinking, without deciding, without the calculation that had governed every other moment of his isolated years. Just opened it and found her there with the morning behind her and the whole world rearranged. He thought that was the best thing he had ever done without thinking. He thought he would spend the rest of his life glad of it. And he did. The Brenner Ranch stood on the edge of the Llano Estacado for many years after that, the cottonwood at the gate growing larger every season, the morning glories coming back each summer without fail. The 3 Brenner children grew into people their parents were proud of, each in their own particular way. Samuel, who had his father's directness and his mother's practicality, eventually took up the ranch work with genuine skill and a love for the land that was entirely his own. Clara became the person in the county that people came to when they needed something thought through carefully, which was her mother's gift worn in a different shape. James was the loud one, the surprising one, the one who changed direction twice and eventually found his way to something no one had predicted, which was also, in the end, exactly right. Clem Hadley never left. He became, over the years, as much a part of the Brenner operation as the land itself, eventually building his own small house at the east end of the property when he married a woman named Dorothea, who had the laugh of someone who found the world genuinely funny, and who got along with Annie immediately and well. Their children grew up alongside the Brenner children in the easy way of families who are not family by blood, but are by everything else. Thomas Easton remained in Crestfall as its sheriff for 19 years, until age and a grateful community gave him the retirement he had long since earned. He stayed in Crestfall after, because he had no reason to leave and every reason to stay. His sister was there, and his nephews and niece, and a life he had built from the ground up and was satisfied with. Pete Darrow's general store continued to be the center of Crestfall's commerce and much of its social life until Pete's son took it over in 1895, and Pete, to his own slight surprise, discovered that retirement agreed with him. Mrs. Garza's garden grew and flourished and was tended and attended and beloved, and she lived to be very old and was cared for in her final years partly by Annie, who sat with her in the garden in the good weather and in the kitchen in the cold, and who told her without embarrassment that she was one of the most important people in her life. And Mrs. Garza received this with the tranquility of someone who has lived long enough to know what is true and what is not, and to be glad of the true things. She passed in the winter of 1896, peacefully, and Annie grieved her fully and then carried her forward the way you carry forward the people who shaped you, in the particular things you do and the way you do them and the values you pass on to the people who come after. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, in the spring of 1904, Noah and Annie Brenner sat on the porch of their ranch house in the last light of the day, which was the color of gold, and doing what it always did over the flat Texas land, making everything look briefly like a painting. The house behind them was full of the sounds of a busy and well-used home. The land in front of them was unchanged in its essential nature, still vast and demanding and beautiful in the way that only the Llano Estacado could be beautiful, which was not gentle but was real. 20 years, Noah said. Almost 21, Annie said. We are rounding up. "We are celebrating," he said. "We can round how we like." She leaned against him and felt the solid, familiar warmth of him beside her. And she thought about the long shape of it, 20 years, and the 3 children asleep and not asleep inside, and the geranium still on the windowsill in a succession that was now 4 generations from the original, and the morning glories on the fence that had come back every year without fail for 20 years, and the scratch on the kitchen table, and everything that had accumulated and layered and built itself into the life they had made. "I am glad I brought that pie," she said. He turned to look at her with the look she loved, the one that had started in that first August morning and had been added to and deepened with every year since, the look of a man who cannot believe his luck and has decided that believing in it is worth the vulnerability that comes with it. "I am glad I opened the door," he said. "I know you did not mean to," she said. "No," he said. "I did not. I heard the knock and I just opened it." He paused. "I think some part of me had been waiting." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think you were ready even if you did not know it. The morning glories on the fence, the geranium in the window. Things a person does when they have not entirely given up on the idea of a world worth tending." He looked at the fence and the morning glories, and he was quiet with that for a moment, in the way he was quiet with things that landed truly. "Maybe," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the Texas evening went on doing what it did, which was going dark very slowly and very beautifully, the stars arriving one by one in the enormous sky, and the sound of the land around them in the night, and the sound of their house behind them, and the warmth of him beside her. She had walked through a gate with a warm pie in her hands on an August morning 21 years ago, and she had found a man at a door and a life waiting past it, and she had chosen it, and it had been, in every respect that mattered, exactly enough. It had been, in every respect that mattered, everything.